really feel invited into the community. Okay, so how do I'm sorry, how do I get past this screen?
There you go.
There you go.
Sorry.
Okay. Always look for the escape.
Always look for the escape.
Okay. So what do I mean by anarchism, first of all? Anarchists struggle against all forms of domination, oppressively vertical relationships, like white supremacy, white over black, patriarchy, men over women, colonialism, colonizer over subject, the state, governors over governed, the class system, ruling class over proletariat, or heteronormativity, normative over deviant. And we struggle for a world of horizontal relationships. Although Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the problematic person who first called himself an anarchist, thought of the preferable form of relationships rather as spherical. On the surface of a sphere like the Earth, every single point is the center, and the margin is, strictly speaking, nowhere. We assume that anything worth doing can be done cooperatively and democratically rather than coercively and hierarchically. And we seek to bring that about, starting with ourselves and our own projects of social transformation. And this has interesting consequences for thought, since so many of the world's systems of thinking have been constructed so as to justify the vertical world of transcendent power in one way or another, or at least to apologize for the supposed necessity. Even if you're not a committed anarchist, then, you might do well to adopt what James C. Scott calls an anarchist squint. It's a funny word. I appreciate how you defamiliarized it for me earlier. But an anarchist squint, a way of looking at the world that takes none of its power arrangements for granted, or as anything like a God-given or natural or logical necessity. The organization that I work with, the Institute for Anarchist Studies, has been sponsoring research that employs such a squint for some 27 years now. And without our having penned any group manifestos or signed any doctrinal statements, what I've just said is more or less what I and all my comrades agree. Anarchism understood this way owes its intellectual descent to a branch of the 19th century workers' movement, just as you were saying, Luis, which found expression in the writings of people like Proudhon, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin, and was spread to the Americas, Australia, and East Asia by the early 20th century. At the same time, the goals and tactics of anarchism are no one's invention, strictly speaking, but can be found almost everywhere in spontaneous practices of mutual aid and egalitarian social organization that date from so-called prehistory. This is why the Aymara anarcho-feminist Julieta Paredes says that we're not anarchists by Bakunin or the CNT, but rather by our grandmothers. I love that idea of anarchism from our grandmothers. Similarly, black anarchism has its own genealogy in black emancipation struggles, particularly in lessons drawn from the experience of the Black Panther Party. Although Marquis Bey suggests that black anarchism can be rooted not in any genealogy, so much as a differently inflected mode of relating to being amongst others. We've come from many different historical experiences, in other words, but in asking similar questions, we've found some of the same answers. So what is a theory of life? We could say that it's a philosophy of biology, an account of what organisms are, what it means to be alive. We might go further and call it an ontology, an account of the nature of nature, that is, reality itself. I'm stealing that from David Graeber in his preface to Kropotkin's Mutual Aid. The nature of nature as the nature of reality. Anarchism offers a kind of biology, then, that is simultaneously an ontology, an account of how the world really is, as Almeida says. I'll talk about him later. Is the life of the mind something distinct from matter? Is life a veil of tears? Is life a struggle to the death for survival? What is possible for life in the world? What should we living beings expect? So this is another aspect of what I mean by a theory of life. The theory of life that is commonly attributed to anarchism, understood mistakenly in my view as a position within Western political philosophy, is that anarchists attribute a natural goodness to human nature, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Whom like all the early anarchists just hated. But that unlike Rousseau, anarchists fail to acknowledge that civilization requires certain sacrifices, after all, since the freedom of each encounters a limit in the freedom of others. It's said that anarchists have a too generous ontology, one that foolishly assumes the best of people when really people are self-serving, each of us looking out for his or her own benefit. At least this is what people say, who assume with Adam Smith that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own self-interest. That is to say, such critics are possessed of a liberal ontology, one from which there is always already in the first place a self-contained self, equipped with pre-existing interests. This is not to say that anarchists necessarily disbelieve in the reality of the self, on the contrary. Only that, for us, this porous self is always comprised of others, so much so that any interests to speak of are inevitably entangled with those of the others. Thus, as Bakunin says, we do not live in a universe where my rights are limited by yours, my freedom by your freedom, contra Rousseau. Rather, my personal freedom confirmed by the liberty of all extends to infinity. This freedom and interdependency for Kropotkin is not only a social condition, but a biological fact that precedes, or is at least co-equal with, any individual struggle for life. This is where the theory of mutual aid as a factor of evolution arises. My friend Eugene Kuchinov calls this Kropotkin's method of anteriorization, pushing the principle of mutual aid down into the depths of the pre-human, into animal life, the life of insects, plants, and so forth. Chiara Bottici points out that contemporary Western biology not only grudgingly acknowledges what it calls group selection, the cooperative behavior of social species as an advantage for survival, but also the even more fundamental phenomenon of symbiosis. I am a symbiote, a coalition of human cells with vast colonies of bacteria, almost 40 trillion of them, I read, that need one another to live at all. In thinking about an anarchist theory of life, we could also sharpen that idea by considering the theory of our opposite numbers, the fascists. Fascist theories of anything, of course, cannot be held to any standard of coherence. Only their liberal opponents expect coherence in their discourse, as many have pointed out, so that fascists alone are free to contradict themselves as it pleases them. And nonetheless, there are some reiterating themes. For the fascists, as Mark Neocleus writes, there is such a thing as nature, which is simultaneously imagined in terms of constant mobility, constant change, struggle, and perpetual war, and the immobility of natural universal law. Races, essentially immutable, some subhuman, others superhuman, are pitted against one another to keep their place in nature. The specter of extinction hangs over everything, and the purity of the master race must be jealously guarded. Hence the current appeal of great replacement conspiracy theories, eugenics, so-called tradwives, and race realism. That's a lot of garbage, naturally. But it does make one pause and think about the role of nature in political thought. It's tempting to simply say, better nothing by nature, better no theory of life at all. But this is to concede infinitely too much to the fascists, particularly given the urgency of attending to the living world that capitalism has imperiled. And at times, the no theory of life has also been a fascist theory. That is to say, it's also sometimes convenient for fascists to assume that what is real is just a formless slurry of substance to which form must be added from the outside. That nothing is what it is until the right leader comes along to bully it into shapely obedience. This is what Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, following Gilles Simondon, call the hylomorphic model, the ontology passed down to us from Aristotle that regards the material world as just so much raw stuff, or hyle, to be pressed into shape, that's the morphe, by a master architect. As John Pertevie remarks, such an ontology resonates with fascist desire. The leader comes from on high to rescue the chaos of the people by his imposition of order The soul rules the body from on high, the will whips the body into shape, and so on. And as Catherine Malibu would warn us, if we squint at it a little bit more, we can recognize a neoliberal ontology, a model of a world without ecological limits, a world where employees are infinitely flexible and compliant. Now, anarchism begins in many times and places, but one place it can be said to begin from is Mikhail Bakunin's declaration that such an ontological model is false and pernicious. For us, he says, matter is not at all this inert substratum produced by human abstraction, this uniform, formless, and abstract matter. Instead, for Bakunin and others, matter is spontaneously and eternally mobile, active, productive. This is a properly Deleuzian conception of of matter and nature as full of implicit forms, with which the artisan negotiates, as in the case of woodworking. The variable undulations and torsions of the fibers guiding the operation of splitting wood, so that the form must be seen as suggested by the matter rather than the pure product of the mind of the architect. That's John Pertevi's words on borrowing. Pache Malibu, the very plasticity of such materials, their ability to receive and give as well as to destroy forms, is a function of their implicit forms. For instance, the famous plasticity of clay is, wet clay at least, is a function of the ability of its scale-like particles, moistened and lubricated by moisture, to slide over one another. So Murray Bookchin cites the example of the Inuit craftsman who turned the piece of raw ivory gently this way and that way, whispering to it, "Who are you? Who hides in you?" The theory of life that is implicit in this European tradition of anarchism, in other words, rejoins the indigenous traditions of stateless and moneyless cultures around the world. If it but knew itself, it is in fact animist. Even less widely known than this, however, is a history of anarchist fascination with another theory of life, springing from scientific research and speculation that unfolded between the dawn of the 20th century and the 1940s, which went by the names of synthetic biology, plasmogeny, and universal life. The concept was as simple as it was beguiling. The origin of life from non-living chemical processes was not such an unthinkable leap as it might seem, because some of those chemicals could, in the right combinations and conditions, manifest lifelike structures and even behaviors, even inorganic matter. These findings, initially published in mainstream scientific journals, found their way into the science columns of transatlantic anarchist publications such as L'Anarchie, La Revista Blanca, L'Andeor, and Estudios. And such well-known anarchist personalities as Fernando Tarrida del Marmol and Maria Lacerda de Mura gave it credence. Sebastian Faure gave it a place in his 4-volume Encyclopédie Anarchiste, the Anarchist Encyclopedia of 1934, consecrating it as part of the recognized body of anarchist culture, as Sanford Jefferson would say, following Bourdieu. For the adherents of this precocious biophilosophy, life and even sentience, agency, and thought were much more widely distributed phenomena than Western humanism had supposed. As Jorge Quintana Navarrete writes, the plasmogenists proposed a definition of life as an inorganic and anarchic flow that ultimately destroys biopolitical norms and hierarchies. If living matter could spring from the self-organizing properties of non-living matter, wouldn't that blur the boundaries between life and non-life? Said Alfonso El Herrera, the Mexican biologist, I am happy to give life to everything. He was writing in the pages of La Vie Universelle, the house organ of the International Biocosmic Association. In reality, all is life, and no limit can be conceived between its various forms, the same atoms passing from organized to inorganic bodies through infinite combinations. And if we consider life as movement in the universe, nothing is death. Or, as Bookchin would write a half a century later, in effect, matter is active, and it strives to realize itself, its latent potentialities, through a nisus, an intrinsic striving, drive towards self-organization and self-creation that is inherent in non-human phenomena. While the adherents of Herrera's would-be science of living forms did not share Bookchin's teleological interpretation of this self-organization in the sense that each being has just one true and correct form of development. They certainly shared his sense of matter as intrinsically active, spontaneous, living. And this is, of course, the great theme of the so-called new materialist thinkers, who variously describe matter as possessing a livingness, quasi-subjectivity, an emergent agency, or simply a vibrancy that defies the human-centered hierarchy of the hylomorphic model. If many of the well-known new materialists explicitly align themselves with neighboring tendencies such as ecofeminism, none to my knowledge have espoused anarchism. Nevertheless, we share with them a theory of life, a biology and an ontology that are no longer erected around the cult of the leader, the subject, the architect who gives meaning and direction to a passive material substance. Now, the ontology of matter might sound like an odd thing for anarchists to concern themselves with. First of all, it's dreadfully abstract, seemingly far removed from the immediate questions of how to achieve freedom and equality. No one talks about ontology for decades. It might pose a distraction from the matter at hand. Worse yet, such dreadful abstraction might even be pernicious, as the Strange Matters Collective put it in their manifesto. Another name for ontology is often metaphysics. That is, the study of that which lay beyond and underlies the physical. And that has a terrible reputation now as a profoundly arrogant exercise. As this collective continues, the basic idea was that if you could figure out what had to be true of metaphysical necessity, then you would understand the essential nature of the entities and objects around you, and quite possibly the entire nature of the universe itself. And because truth was seen to be unitary, objective, and all-encompassing, that which was not the truth had to be false. At best, an error to be corrected, and at worst, a wicked heresy to be expunged. And how this kind of ontology connects to religion, state despotism, and imperialism hardly needs spelling out. Obviously, this is far from what anarchists have intended or countenanced. In fact, concerning ontology, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is clear that his anarchism supposes an ontology of the group, of the multiple, and that the old philosophical search for the immutable, the eternal, the perfect, and the definitive had to be pretty definitively abandoned. Rather than looking for something pure and unified, we should think in terms of the messy and multiple. The living human being, Proudhon declared, is a group, like the plants and the crystal. Nowadays, we might instead say an assemblage, right? If to be is to be brute, if something like society is real, not only individuals, then collective action is that much less difficult to imagine, yes? So even if ontology isn't quite happening at the barricades, it might be part of what gets us to the barricades in the first place. That is not to say that anarchists by and large, or even anarchist theorists in particular, apart from Proudhon, have batted around the word ontology a lot. Yet, no less than an anarchist than Errico Malatesta took the time to consider whether or not the state had any reality of its own, apart from the people comprising it at any given point in time, such that this entity could possess certain given attributes of reason, justice, and equity independently of the people who compose the government. It does not, he decided. And those who believe it does have fallen ill with a disease of the human mind, he said, called the metaphysical tendency. Or as Proudhon would have said, the state is just a group of human beings with special interests and privileges. The abstract state, say the United States, land of the free, has no real existence outside of that concrete living group. So it is a saying, as the contemporary anthropologist Mauro Almeida would put it, Malatesta declared ontological war on the state. Ontological wars, Almeida writes, are a continuation of material wars. To justify the war against unions and the destruction of mining communities in England, Margaret Thatcher famously stated that society does not exist. As in the wars of religion that aim to eliminate beliefs in order to eliminate the believers, Thatcher aimed at the ontological elimination of the mine worker class to justify its destruction de facto. The grim inverse symmetry between the state does not exist and society does not exist, right, might make us wonder, is there any end to these ontological wars? Are human beings cut off from any sure knowledge of the real, fated to declare one another's non-existence until doomsday, when our non-existence is going to become real? Well, Almeida thinks not. He, like a number of other anthropologists, is committed to a conception of pluriversality, a conceptual schema that allows for indefinitely many ontologies to coexist and, crucially, to interact with each other. The key to doing so, particularly in light of the urgency of collective action in the face of climate disaster, is to adopt a kind of pragmatism in negotiating between different realities. He writes that multiple ontologies associated with science and local worldviews can form alliances with one another against the destruction of a common world, which is the world pragmatically accessible due to its effects such as the pollution of rivers, the irregularity of natural rhythms, unusual warming, extraordinary floods and droughts, as well as associated social phenomena such as famine, unemployment, and mortality. Not to mention very nice Februaries. He calls this stance ontological anarchism, not in a knowing way. I see no sign that he places himself within the anarchist tradition politically, but in an eminently fitting way. Anarchism is indeed a pragmatism, a practice of functionally getting along together that always asks a theory, what is it good for whom and what does it function? As Purdue insists, the idea is born from action and must return to action. So maybe then we could speak about an anarchist theory of life not only as a particular ontology, a materialist ontology that's oriented towards process and multiplicity, that was formulated by a few white European men in the 19th century, nor as a series of biological concepts like mutual aid, plasmogeny, and universal life emerging between the 1890s and 1930s, but as a practice of negotiating between ontologies, navigating between worlds, neither as immigrants nor as conquistadors, but as a kind of ambassador seeking a collective way forward. I think Mauro Almeida is right to declare the major challenge is how to reconcile the scientific consensus on warming and pandemics with respecting the incommensurability of local ontologies. And that the answer must come in the form of a practice of seeking pragmatic truths that are common to different ontologies, as a means of ontological peacemaking. An anarchist theory of life on this model would avoid assuming that material reality is a passive substance waiting to be given form, while at the same time recognizing that it is plastic enough, or promiscuous enough, as the philosopher Jean Dupré calls it, to lend itself to many, indefinitely many ontologies, to play host to many worlds. Moreover, it would admit the infinite variety of lived worlds and the possibility of translating criteria of truth and ethics through all of them, as Almeida proposes. Poetically, for a moment, perhaps life could be less like war and more like a never-ending process of translation. An anarchist theory of life is far from being free of ethical problems, to be sure. If we are sufficiently alive to things, to borrow Ting and Gould's phrase, we find ourselves in a world of things that are as alive as us, perhaps sentient like us, perhaps endowed with agency like us, from animal to vegetable to mineral and beyond. What ethics should characterize our relation to non-human things, to artificial general intelligence, whenever that shows up, because it hasn't yet, to other species? These questions have been asked by anarchists in the European descendant tradition and answered in a variety of different ways. The 1934 Encyclopédie Anarchiste has substantial entries for both végétarisme and végétalisme, vegetarianism and veganism. Two positions remarkably popular among anarchists, including such famous leaders and theorists as Élisée Reclus and Louise Michel, but characterizing only a minority in practice. A 2010 survey found that contemporary green anarchists, anarcho-primitivists, and anarcho-feminists are least likely to be omnivores, and that the biggest percentage of anarchist vegans is among anarcho-feminists, 19.3%, somewhere between 20 to 40 times as prevalent as in the general population, followed by green anarchists. Those likeliest to report being omnivores were those who define themselves by the more traditional tendencies of anarchist individualism, 75.1%, platformism, 63%, anarchist communism, 62%, and anarcho-syndicalism, 61.8%. So the upshot of this is that although any sizable anarchist gathering is pretty much guaranteed to feature vegan food, true consensus is elusive. Why? In the Euro-descendant anarchist tradition, the ethical norms of solidarity and mutual aid are closely intertwined with mutual recognition and reciprocity. In the little philosophical lexicon of anarchism, Daniel Cohn suggests that the necessary condition for reciprocity is the capacity to speak for oneself, to act in one's own name, and so to form collective entities. Like it or not, he argues, the anti-speciesists cannot help situating themselves as the animal's spokespersons or representatives, representing the animal cause, and at the same time benefiting from this representation. Here, I think Coulson comes perilously close to adopting a kind of Kantian ethical standard of maturity, or mündigkeit, from the root word mund, or mouth. That is, he makes entry into the human sphere of ethical relations contingent on possessing the ability to speak a human language, and hence excludes many kinds of non-speaking human beings, as well as animals. But even if animals can't speak for themselves, Coulson suggests, they can do other things, an infinity that opens up a great number of possibilities in the relations we maintain with them, as well as with all that exists. He doesn't elaborate. Ivona Janiska, the author of Theorizing Contemporary Anarchism, argues that we need not regard the rest of the universe as silent. Rather, in our relations with the non-human world, we simply need more and more elaborate translation protocols. Humans do not give meaning to non-human entities as such, or interpret group matter, she contends. Rather, they create favorable conditions in which non-human entities become visible. In order to do that, however, non-humans and humans alike require a set of devices, gestures, settings, procedures, instruments, trials, and sites. They need the right infrastructure to capture and amplify their speech that would also be proper to their mode of existence. This seems to be consistent with an anarchist theory of life. But it doesn't answer our ethical questions. Indeed, it opens the way to more of them. For what creatures cannot then speak, given the right apparatus, the right collective assemblage of enunciation, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it? We now know, thanks to some special instruments, that bats quarrel with each other. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful piece of knowledge. Tarida Del Marmo, who is intensely interested in scientific experiments that probed the sensitivity of plants, would doubtless be hardened by recent studies of the transmission of signals between trees by means of fungal mycelial networks. Fungus is really having a moment right now in popular culture and thought. So these trees are communicating with each other through the mycelial networks, signaling that may even foster cognition. As the great anarchist science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin argues, why not even imagine a wholly atemporal, whole, volcanic poetry of the rocks, each one a word spoken, how long ago, by the earth itself? Would our ethical responsibilities end anywhere? The entirety of animal ethics and land ethics in relation to anarchism, which I realize I've gotten myself into hot water here, is a little too large a subject for me to treat properly here, and it's an area that I've only really begun to explore. I will just make two observations. First, it seems to me that the more well-defined traditions of ethical and moral philosophy rarely supply useful resources for anarchists. Peter Singer's utilitarianism, for instance, which cancels vegetarianism towards animals, but coolly contemplates euthanizing children when the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, repels us. And Kant's abstract universalistic regime of rights seems problematic as well. Secondly, it may be that common indigenous theories of life, which invite us to think of food in relational terms, offer better and more internally consistent kinds of stances, combining omnivorous diets with concepts of kinship between animals and other animals, humans and other animals, and regarding lands as persons with interests that must be respected, with accompanying practices of reciprocity. The question, to follow Alexis Shotwell's very useful suggestions, is not how to become indigenous, which is impossible, Pache, Robin, and Wall Kimmerer, but how to get into better relations with one another, with animals, and with the land. It's the practical side of those questions that we need to attend to, maybe even more than the conceptual. The anthropologist Dave Afton-Gillian argues that non-indigenous peoples can learn many things from indigenous ethical traditions concerning animals and the earth, but that as non-indigenous people, we can't simply adopt their ethics because we lack the conviction that lack of respect for the non-human world will have direct consequences for our personal survival. Whereas the Cohn, for example, believed that overhunting, wasting meat, disrespecting an animal in a variety of ways carry the risk of serious consequences to the offender or their relatives, from inability to catch that animal anymore to serious illness or even death. So our supposedly disenchanted modern worldview and nuclear family structure provide no basis for such belief. And our technological infrastructure has so far largely insulated those of us in the more privileged classes and nations from the consequences of overfishing and overfarming, food waste, pollution, destruction of habitats, and so on. From an anarchist perspective, this is precisely why we need to drastically alter not only our worldviews, but our family structures, our practices of fishing and farming, our energy sources and technologies, and so on, as well as to create anew for ourselves an environmental sensorium, and what one might call an affectorium, that is a faculty for feeling, or an emotional repertoire that allows us to really perceive and feel the consequences of our collective decisions. One thinks of science fiction stories that describe just such a prospect of extending the human sensorium and affectorium. In Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which I highly recommend, the protagonists are in many ways made to feel the Earth's wounds, so they may become responsible for its repair, sometimes viscerally, as in Frank May's agonizing experience of being the sole survivor of a high wet bulb temperature event in Uttar Pradesh, and sometimes in the gentler form of a perception, as with the visitors to an enormous scale model of the Bay Area's water flows, or the members of the actually non-fictional 2000 Watt Society, a group dedicated to living within the Earth's means, a ration of about 48 kilowatt hours a day. The society had provided its members with lots of graphs to estimate individual use, Robinson writes, and there were websites on which one could calculate one's energy burn quite closely. In the end, this kind of mild asceticism wins out, and citizens of a world a half-century removed from ours are moved to exclaim in the collective joy of a festival, "Of course," he says, "it's a category error on my part to genderize the planet in that crass way," one man reflects. "But we were high that night on the Worldwide Love Fest. I just kept shouting, 'Mamma mia! Mamma mia!'" Robinson, of course, is a Marxist, not an anarchist, and there is no Earth as Mamma mia for a true historical materialist. For him, animism is a category error, not a founding ontological assumption. In her collection, her contribution to a climate parables series for Anthropocene magazine, the less doctrinaire but decidedly feminist Annalee Newitz describes Deep Leaf, a future city built into the cool walls of a canyon in which water and energy resources are of necessity carefully stewarded. When the protagonist Shruti finds a hidden illegal almond farm, she instinctively responds with an affective horror. Shruti's mind swarmed with ecosystem inputs and outputs, and her anxiety curdled into wrath. The amount of water required to rear such a resource-intensive crop was astronomical. It's her ability to visualize the ecosystem as a whole that allows her to feel outrage on its behalf. So, fortunately for the objects of her wrath, the almond pirates, being caught in the act, are subjected not to a criminal trial, but to a restoration. Anyone could convene a restoration as long as they assemble the appropriate ethical counselors, stakeholders, affected parties, and publicly announce the meeting so that community members could observe and weigh in. Restorative justice, of course, is far from being merely science fictional. Inspired by the kinds of practices common among indigenous communities, it stands as an alternative to the retributive justice system with which we're all too familiar. The basic concept is that when harm has been done to a person or community, the offender needs to do something to repair that damage, that relationship, to be reintegrated into the community. In other words, no one is treated as discardable, much as in Deep Leaf, no water is wastable. Niwa Cohn, water truly is life. If we really want to change the way we behave towards other species and the rest of the world, though, we need not only a new sensorium and affectorium, but new agreed upon inhibitions. What Bakunin called the social power and Ursula K. Le Guin called the social conscience. It seems weird to talk about anarchist inhibitions. Think of it this way. An anarchist is someone who is inhibited from dominating others and refuses to dominate others. To be dominated by others. Two powerful inhibitions at once. According to Sarah Deer and Liz Murphy, among one particular band of Ojibwe, a variety of inhibitions regulate the hunting of deer. 1, only shoot to kill. 2, only take meat that is needed. 3, give thanks to the deer for its life, a practice known as miigwechita gozuli, and place tobacco, known as sama, near the deer before and after the hunt, as semblance of that gratitude. 4, only hunt when sober. And 5, conduct efficient and careful butchering, so as not to disrespect or waste the life the deer give. One can easily see how such codes serve as an ecological regulation, restraining over hunting as well as an ethics. It is indeed a fetishistic relationship to the animal, in a sense that I want to reclaim from the Marxists. The excellence of fetishism for Slavoj Žižek is an as-if relationship to things. I know very well that the deer will not really take revenge on me for my respect, and yet I behave as if it really were. He characterizes the conviction that if I don't do this, some unspeakably horrible X will take place as a psychotic projection of meaning onto the real itself. But that's precisely what we need. To be more specific, it's apparently not enough for us to believe that our ecological misbehavior is going to endanger everybody eventually, starting with the weakest and most marginal people on Earth, and only ultimately touching even the rich and sheltered. To change how we act, we need to act as if that misbehavior endangered us ourselves imminently. That is how the Ojibwe and others have enlisted the drives for self-preservation in the service of ecological balance. And this is why I think we have to rehabilitate the fetish in a certain sense. Over the protests of Zizek and Andreas Malm and Alf Hornborg, and perhaps even Ethan Stanley Robinson, much as I love him, I propose something I call a meta-fetishistic relationship to nature. Stephen Duncombe, who's not an anarchist, but certainly kind of a fellow traveler, has perhaps put it best when he writes, given the phantasmagoric nature of the commodity, it makes sense that consumer activists have often made fantasy the focus of their attack, employing a strategy which might be called defetishizing the commodity. However, more recently, activists have embraced a new strategy that does not reject the fantasy element at the core of the commodity, but instead embraces it and makes it transparent, a dream that presents itself as a dream. Only this transparent form of dreaming can mobilize fantasy and desire within an ethical project. And significantly, his paradigmatic example of such transparent dreaming is the experience of science fiction fandom. Specifically, Star Trek fandom. Watching the original series with friends, Duncan recalls, we longed for a similar world where money had no meaning and racism and sexism had been sort of left behind. But also, we reveled in the melodramatic dialogue, the blocky staging, and William Shatner's overacting. We looked for the scenes in the sets and snickered at the low-rent costumes of the aliens. We loved Star Trek, but we also loved laughing at it. Likewise, Native American reverence toward the universe is frequently shot through with elements of the consciously ridiculous. And what else can one call the Anishinaabe tale of Winnebago and his detachable anus? Winnebago apparently sets his anus to watch over his roasting ducks, guarding them from thieves while he sleeps, and comedy ensues. Lawrence W. Gross points out that studies of Anishinaabe folklore by outsiders tend to emphasize their ecological and ethical aspects, but most fail to recognize that many of the stories are funny, even slapstick. Perhaps these elements of the comic function much like the laughter of Duncan and his activist comrades, as a device for creating a certain ironic, meta-fetishistic distance, a momentary awareness of the as-ifness of one's theory of life. Life sometimes overthrows, but always overflows our theories of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. So we have a good time for questions and discussions, as always. Yes.
I just have
Let me bring the microphones. So yeah, everybody can hear you.
No, it's just practical. Can you put your works cited first page back up? There are people that want pictures, yeah.
Oh,
That's a good one. I took a lot of pictures too of the references. Yes, Hannah over there.
Thank you so very much for this fascinating lecture. And I was just wondering, I have a few questions, or I could have a long list, but you were like showing lots of examples, activism on indigenous communities. Would you think that maybe anarchism is one of those, or anarchist studies is one of those disciplines which actually is getting decolonized and has a lot of activism? And that lots of people who are sort of practicing thinking about anarchism, that at the same time they do the mutual aid, or that they are actually activists, right? Just, so, and where are the hotspots of like anarchist thoughts today?
Yeah, so if I understand your question right, there's two components. Like one is are anarchists engaged in decolonizing their own thought? I wish I could say enthusiastically yes. I feel like there's a lot of resistance in some corners, particularly among folks who identify more as anarcho-syndicalists. I think sometimes there's a reluctance to admit anything that sounds too anti-rational to them. But I've gotten a lot of positive responses to that article about demodernizing anarchism. So I'm pleasantly surprised. The other question was, are we doing things like mutual aid? Yes.
Like activism.
And activism, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I wanted to ask something. I wasn't here for the first time, or the first part of the lecture, so I'm kind of afraid if I'm going to ask something that has already been said. But I catch the last part about projecting the psychotic impulses into the real, in how does it stand for commodity. So I just wanted to maybe ask a little question in points of anarchism in your theory. Does commodity positions itself as a part of the real, actually, or it stands outside, and how ontologically this is kind of connected, if you understand what my question was?
Ooh, kind of.
Maybe I can rephrase it?
Yeah, could you?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, because you mentioned the real, and then you were talking about the commodity. According to theories of anarchism regarding this very ontological thing, is commodity part of the real, or commodity constitutes the real, or it is completely apart from it? So what is our position according to? Can you understand what
I
I'm
just want
saying?
to add a question to your question because I'm loving it and I was thinking about it too. Just a term there is commodities. Can your theory of animism be applied to commodities as material things, or commodities metaphysics, let's say? You were going that.
I was going in that direction. Actually, what I was trying to ask is real in this context referred as real, the world, Lacanian real, or the material real, actually. And where does commodity stand? Does it have a material meaning, or it's some sort of this Lacanian construct of the real? I don't know if I'm trying this. I'm sorry. I'm confused.
No, actually, sorry. Let's see. I think that there's a couple ways that I could start to answer that, maybe. Okay, one is to say that we don't have to be uncritical towards commodity culture, right, and the commodity, just because we attribute this kind of liveliness to things. I think we can recognize the commodity relationship as a destructive and oppressive relationship. And then there's a second component of the question that had to do with the Lacanian real, which is a concept that I'm kind of, at best ambivalent towards, and maybe actually kind of skeptical about right now. Lacan likes to do this thing that my mother complains about, which is that you academics, she says, you take nice ordinary words and then you use them in a way that nobody else uses them.
So you meant the real, not the locate.
Right, it's the real versus the Lacanian real. Have I answered your question, Rahul?
In a way, yeah.
Or did I just
I will try
artfully
to
dodge it?
reformulate it in a more comprehensible manner for myself and for you. But I guess the question was, does the commodity exist in material work that we're trying to make a relationship with, or it stands outside of that sort of question? What is it?
Well, it's real enough in the sense that it has pragmatic effects on us, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in that small R way, yes. Unfortunately, right? Detrimentally. Okay.
Okay, something you just mentioned made me a little bit curious about some of the critique, or ways we could critique anarcho-syndicalism. And you got me thinking after reading your piece earlier, is it that anarcho-syndicalists believe that the power should lie with the workers, and decision-making should lie with the workers, but a more anarchist school of thought would be that it should be with autonomous communities, and not just the workers. And then thinking now, in our future now, there's so much maybe work that doesn't need to be happening. And so we need to maybe shift how we think of work. And I'm not making a lot of sense. Could you explain a little more of a critique of that anarcho-syndicalist school of thought?
Ooh, I've tricked myself into attacking anarcho-syndicalism.
Well, I'm just curious, right? Especially as someone who works with unions, right? Thinking of that sort of organizing being a path forward. I would be curious about critiques if they were available, or...
Sure. Well, Murray Bookchin would be your go-to person for that, right? His article, The Ghost of Anarcho-Syndicalism, is a direct attack on the continued relevance or validity of anarcho-syndicalism, because he thinks that autonomous communities need to be the point of organization, not the workplace. I'm a little agnostic about that. I think wherever and whenever you can organize is the place and time to organize. And that's how we do intersectional activism, right? Is we do it in many dimensions at once, as much as we can. I guess if I have any kind of critique of anarcho-syndicalism, it's that some anarcho-syndicalists at least seem to be like they're a little woodsy about that kind of concept, and a little reluctant to really think intersectionally. Maybe anarcho-communists are a little more broad-minded. I don't know if I can generalize like that. I apologize to any anarcho-syndicalists out there.
I have a question back here. Thank you so much for your speaking and everything. I was just wondering how you viewed the theory of humanity, essentially. You talk about the theory of life typically attributed to anarchism is that there's a natural goodness in people. So if we just got rid of these institutions, we'd all just sing kumbaya and work together. So I guess my question is, what is your theory of humanity beyond just life is a group, as you said in the latter part of your presentation?
Oh, so human nature, you mean?
Yeah, human nature.
Yeah. Well, we're equipped with all kinds of potentials, and we seem to be tapping into some of the worst ones at the moment. Right? But different social organizations and different kinds of culture can pull out, develop, enhance, extend different potentials, right? In other words, this is just a fancy way of saying it depends, right? Yeah, it depends.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to ask a question too.
Thank you. presentation, and I got slightly frightened at the end when you started talking about the transparent dreaming and fetish, recovery, taking fetish back from the Marxists, which sounds like a fantastic idea, and some of the imagery you're using. And just as I'm feeling very swept up in it, I'm also sort of reminded that some of these things are fascism's favorite songs. You know, the fetish, the ritual, the recovery of this false indigeneity, of this, you know, chthonic view of the human, you know. And what my question is just simply this: how do I dream transparently? How am I supposed to distinguish between what sounds to me like a promising direction, political direction, and something that is, quite frankly, a very terrifying political direction?
Yeah, always that need to draw a line, right? That's interesting. I would not think of fascism in the same breath as this transparent dreaming. I think, I don't know, to be a fascist, do you have to have an opaque dream? Yeah, I think so. It's hard to be fascist and not at the same time somehow self-deluding, I think. I don't know, actually, that's a really good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. I should think about that. Yeah. And the distinction seems obvious, but also hard to put my finger on.
I want to ask a question myself, and it connects really with this. I think I enjoyed a lot your presentation, and the ending I was not expecting when you get us to the metaphysicism and what we need, right? The acting as if. You really surprised me there, and it all builds from the animism part that you've been. I could see you've been developing for a while. And you're quite convincing that there's something about animism that connects profoundly with anarchism as a critique of metaphysics or of ontology, right? A critique, in plain English, we can say a critique of abstractions, right? Of transcendental abstractions, right? So you're thinking spirituality here in a way that is not like the religious spirituality of transcendental religions, but more other kind of pagan religions, let's say, that are not transcendental, that are about real material things there. But I feel, when you were presenting all of these, that I feel you're speaking to a need of the present. Okay, the question is, would you agree that there seems to be a sort of need in the present, especially in the left and in the revolutionary left, for the articulation of some sort of spirituality, like the death of God has become intolerable in the end of the world suddenly? Are you seeing this? I kind of see it in your work, but my question for you is that, are you seeing this in the search for revolutionary spiritualities, let's say? You don't use that word, but I feel like you're very close to it with animism, right? And is there a danger in that? I feel like the danger that you were seeing is one that I see too. But
yeah, I never tell other people, you know, develop your spirituality. You need to be spiritual, but I think we don't have to be frightened of it. And to again have that sort of pragmatist recognition that we might still agree in practice, right? Even if we have very different language for what we're doing. I thought of myself as an atheist for a very long time, and then basically kind of relativized myself out of it. I realized that what some other people were doing with religious language was really just the same kinds of practice of what I would call love or solidarity. That I endorsed myself, and you know that if it's a difference of words, there's no one right vocabulary. So in that sense, yeah, sure, be spiritual. And, you know, but to take your question more seriously, I think maybe what you're partly speaking to is what some have talked about as an affective deficit, right, or motivational deficit,
Yeah.
right? That we get sunk in cynicism and gloom and pessimism to the point that we can't act anymore. And in that sense, yeah, we need an infusion of what I might rather call meaning. Yeah.
Just a quick question. How would an anarchistic movement today guard against being co-opted by charismatic figures?
By a charismatic figure? Well, we don't like charismatic figures a lot.
Nope.
Having a healthy distrust of charismatic figures really helps. You know, and recognizing how many of them have let us down in the past. You know, including some of our intellectual heroes. Right? You know, as I hope I was laudable in introducing Purdue as a problematic person. You know, he was an anti-Semite. You know, and had retrograde views about a number of things, but especially women. Yeah, even you know the big names in anarchism are not like a holy canon. There was an interesting issue actually of anarchist studies a while ago. Not anarchist studies. Anarchist developments in cultural studies that was dedicated to questions about the canon. And people had lots of different interesting takes on that. But you know, for me, anarchism is a tradition without a canon. You know, anybody can speak in its name, and everybody needs to think for themselves. Yeah. But you know, probably that doesn't comfort you at all. Charismatic figures are notoriously lovely.
Just a question right here.
Sure.
So thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. You kind of introduced this idea of like the ridiculousness and like slapstick comedy
Yeah.
to understand theories of life. I was wondering if you could expand on how that translates into material action and like anarchist collective action like in the material world.
Ooh. Yeah. So how do you act in a way that's kind of appropriately comical, slapstick? Maybe better, playful. That's been a question that anarchists have been involved with for a while. Not as much preoccupied with it recently, to be fair. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of people were talking about the need for more playful forms of activism, for forms of activism that would kind of gently deflate the figure of the activist even. There's a famous essay by somebody, I think styled Andrew X, called "Give Up Activism," which is not about being you know, indifferent to politics or passive at all, but about sort of avoiding positioning yourself as you know, in this too serious position of being the activist, and finding ways to undercut that sort of relationship. So that might be one kind of direction to look in for the comedic impulse. Yeah. But that's a really big question. That's like an area for exploration. If you want to write about it, you should.
I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the animism and sort of its role in the zeitgeist and things like that, and I'm curious if you can identify any, especially technological trends that gives you hope in terms of realizing, you know, the anarchist potential or you know, prototype communities, things like that, that basically helps make that achievable or you know, increasingly defensible maybe in the environment.
Yeah, there's lots of things that afford me some hope. You know, technology maybe not leading among them at the moment. Yeah, but my friend John Slavin, for instance, in Virginia, has this wonderful kind of open laboratory. He's gathered used scientific equipment and so forth, and had a lot of donations, and he essentially maintains this open source laboratory that other people can come and do science in. And one of his own lines of research has actually led into what he thinks are at least some really promising improvements to solar technology. That would be unbelievably fantastic if that pans out. In terms of communities that are doing things that I think are inspiring, the Zapatistas, the Kurds in northern Syria, whole lots of other groups and forces, I think, are doing things that are, if not capital A anarchist, are still about mutual aid and egalitarian organization and this very radical kind of democracy that I respect.
My undergrads here that just read the Zapatistas, see, I'm not making it up.
Building off of a previous question, for the ways of organizing that you're discussing, there's three parts, how stable are they in maintaining their situation? So, for example, capitalism is trying to grow, see continuous growth. And in a finite world, infinite growth is not possible, so the state will eventually collapse. How stable are these states? What forces do they have to maintain stability from internal or external forces? And are there any weaknesses in the system that could be exploited by those forces?
In other words, is it really hard to have a revolution and defend it? Yeah. We're betting over 1,000, I think. In sort of absolute terms, there are like I was saying, all these really interesting kinds of exceptions, and it's hard to prevent the same kinds of anarchic organization from sprouting up again and again and again. Right? Hannah Arendt kind of refers to it as a kind of perennial sort of politics. You see it in the French Revolution, in the development of district organizations in Paris, the ward system. You see it again in the Paris Commune. You see it again in other places. You see it again in Hungary in 1956. So we have that going for us. We keep very stubbornly reinventing anarchism and trying to update it and make it relevant. But the ultimate answers of how we hold down a piece of ground and prevent it from being overwhelmed again by empire, that is something we haven't found an answer to yet. I don't know that it's due to some lack of a great theoretical concept, although maybe some concept will clarify how to do that. But it's sort of I'm going to give another disappointing "it depends" answer. Even I don't like my answer. You're right. It's a tough problem and an unsolved problem.
Somewhat related to that theme, I'm curious if we take the assumption that an anarchist community would be viable, would be successful, prosperous, whatnot, are there problems with that assumption when it sits alongside other non-anarchist communities, where there are opportunities for some sort of arbitrage between these modes of organization that suddenly makes it unviable or particularly problematic?
Okay, so you're imagining a situation in which, say, an anarchist commune emerges, and right next to it is something like Schenectady, and they have to somehow coexist. But I'm being a little silly, but that's kind of the scenario.
Yeah, so the previous question had to do with, basically aggression, being absorbed into a larger state, but not so much the emphasis on that, but rather just from a commercial and citizen perspective, the movement of people and goods between these different modes of organization. Does that pose some sort of inherent problem for what otherwise would have been a viable form of organization?
I think there are some good questions buried in there. There are questions about economics and sort of the practical details of how anarchist communities work. I think though the sort of larger question, could you have sort of peaceful coexistence with a non-anarchist world, is if that's the question, it's probably not, right? In the long run, that's conflict would need to happen. At least as far as capitalism in the state goes, right? I can easily imagine anarchist communities existing alongside all kinds of other communities that don't call themselves anarchists, but that also have an egalitarian sort of organization and don't like to beat up other people for their goods and so forth.
It seems that that's how it happens with anarchist insurrections in societies and revolutions, like the Zapatistas. The idea that they happen, they're small and sprinkled all around, contrary to communism or capitalism that represent one global revolution, right? In that sense, that goes to your argument that the way the anarchist revolutions, right, happen, appeal to a theory of life, right? Like, because in nature, nothing takes over everything, right? Everything is,
Yeah.
I'm afraid we gotta stop because we gotta leave the Sheldon by 7. But thank you all for coming. Thank you for this discussion, and thank you, Jesse. Thank you very much.
Thank you.